everyone. My name is Paige Brumman. I'm an NDSU Extension Agent in Ward County, and today we're going to kick off the meeting with Dr. Greg Endres. He's an NDSU Extension Cropping System Specialist based out of the Carrington Research Extension Center. He's going to visit with us about a spring wheat variety update.
All right, thank you, Paige, for the introduction and greetings to all on this chilly morning. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started with the presentation. Is that looking okay, Paige?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so I had the task of giving you an update on wheat variety performance, and it's always a bit of a challenge putting the information together to make it useful, and my very simple objective is to funnel, if you will, the vast amount of information that's out there and have an output that basically gives you a guideline of some varieties to take a look at as you are still planning for 2021. I want to acknowledge Joe Ransom. As mentioned, he's very recently retired, and he contributed to a number of the slides that I'll be sharing with you. And I'm going to miss him. He was a solid professional and led extension in the areas of small grain research and education, as well as in corn. And then another contributor to my presentation is Brian Hansen. Brian is a research agronomist at the Langdon Research Extension Center, and he spends a lot of time on varieties, and I brought a few of his slides or ideas to help enhance the presentation. So to begin, most of you, I'm sure, have seen this listing, either numeric information or a graph form like this, but I think it's a good starting point for us. And so this, of course, is an indicator of what varieties were most popular during the course of the last 5 years. And Igmar and Valda have been at the top for a number of years. And you notice that the varieties that follow, most of them have a downward trend. The exceptions were the west-bred varieties. There's two that are shown here. And then Valda is at the same percent as the previous year in 2019, and it'll be interesting to see which way that goes. So in general, a lot of these varieties are on downward trend, and it'll be very interesting to see if some of the new varieties that are out there, and there's a lot of them, will take their place. I assume everyone's familiar with this regional quality report. I will show a couple slides from screenshots from the publication, and I'd encourage you to take a good look at it. There's a lot of details there on performance of varieties, and especially emphasis on quality, as you would expect. So this is a look at one of the pages from the quality report. On the left-hand side is same information, essentially the same as what I showed you in the graph, just numeric listing of the percent of acres that the varieties have been growing in the past year, 2020 compared to 2019. So that's a reference. What I think is even more important for the audience today is the information on the right-hand side, and that would be the popular varieties, the top 3 varieties actually, grown in various districts in the state. And so I put a box around the west districts. So there's 4 of them that I boxed. And note that the varieties that are at the top of the list are very similar to the statewide varieties. So for example, Igmar, you see, is the #1 variety in all 4 of the districts in the west. And then after that, there's a switch from second to third with Glen, Soren, and Valda. So certainly those are popular varieties. And then you notice in the southwest, Shelley and Barlow are fairly popular. So all of these varieties, they match up with the list on the left-hand side. So I want to show those by districts just to emphasize their importance. And then as you look at the data presented, you can make that comparison of the established varieties or popular ones compared to maybe some of the newer ones that are coming down the road. So a lot of the information that I'll be presenting with you comes from our newly revised performance guide. Hopefully you have a hard copy of it. If not, you can get it from Page or other extension agents or research extension centers. And then of course it is available electronically. So I think a good place to start would be to look at the performance of our popular varieties, if you will. So those that you saw earlier by districts, and I included those, most of them anyway. And so this is a fairly powerful database. It's 12 site years of data from the locations listed in over the last 3 years. I have Igmar designated as a black bar and as a comparison to the other varieties. And it is interesting that even though Igmar is the most popular in the West as well as across the state, notice the yield performance. There's others that are performing better. At the top of the group with this database, it's Shelley and Valda. And that's good, they're good yielders, but one concern we do have is their milling and baking quality is rated as just average. And then other varieties, Soren has been around a long time, been very popular, and it's doing, based on this database, a little bit better than Igmar. And then Glen and Barlow are in the same grouping. So I've been alluding to some new varieties, and we have a lot of them. This may be only a partial list from 2019, but there's, I believe, 12 varieties here from various private and public entities, and so some exciting new varieties to consider. And then in 2020, this is another, again, probably a partial list. There's 10 varieties here of very recently released varieties. And so between the 2 years, there's over 20 varieties here to consider. So it makes it complicated. And actually, with over 20 varieties with these 2 release dates, that's about half of the varieties that NDSU tests and where you'll find information. It's a little over 40 varieties that we have published information in our guide. So they certainly will be candidates based on the numbers. And as you'll see, there's some very positive things with some of these that may allow you to make some replacements in the future. So this is a graph that shows the top performing varieties and then some checks for Western North Dakota. And this is data from just last year. We did this because it does include a number of new varieties, and we don't have a multi-year database of many of these newer ones. And the locations are listed on the bottom: Dickinson, Mandan, Minot, and Williston. You'll notice in this slide and others, I designated the new varieties, those that were released in 2019 or 20. I designated them in different ways, but here, those new ones are designated with the asterisk by their name. Also, the dashed line is the average for the entire trial. So you see that there's lots of varieties that are above the average. So that's exciting. Also notice that the checks that we designated have a tan bar. So they'll stand out a bit from the others. And then I'll just mention ND Froberg is NDSU's newest release, and it has a very nice combination of yield and protein. It's not going to be a top yielder. It's not going to be the top protein, but a very nice combination of those two, besides good test weight, good straw strength, and then it certainly has some desirable disease tolerance, as well as very good quality. So on the yield, by now you've looked at it closely and you notice a buster and trigger at the top of the group. They seem to be on a level higher than the next group that's really tightly bunched from Spitfire all the way down to Torgy. Very little difference on this database and yield amongst these varieties. Okay, I think that's what I have to mention for that slide. Now we'll see a similar slide arrangement, but this is for protein. And the database is across North Dakota from this past season. So it's actually a 10 location average. Set up the same, the new varieties have an asterisk by them. The dashed line is the average for the entire database. And then we have some of our checks, if you will, for established varieties that have a yellow color, and the balance of them have green. And I'll apologize to those of you that might be colorblind. But anyway, so you notice that Bowles stands out. Bowles has been around a few years, a release from University of Minnesota, has excellent quality, and certainly its strength is protein. But we have a lot of other varieties that have excellent protein, and certainly above the trial average and well above the 14% level. So even Fowler made it in this database over the 14% level. So I think that's probably all I'll mention. Just a very good protein year in general. And it'll be interesting to see the performance based on protein with this varieties when we have a year that has very excellent yields. And of course, we'd expect protein to be reduced under that condition. So what's really important, of course, is a combination of the two important factors. So I'm displaying this based on that. These are varieties that have at least average yield in the trial and generally above yield. And this is the database from the West. And then I also included those varieties that have above average protein. And that was based on the statewide database from this past year. So when we put all the varieties under this scrutiny, you notice that we do have 7 that made the cut. And a couple in particular are appealing. The Syngenta variety, this is actually a Clearfield variety, had very nice yield, as well as uptick in protein. And then the other one was Rockford that performed very well in both of the factors. But it's just, it's a nice combination when we can have above average yield and protein. So and you would consider any of these certainly as a complement to maybe a very high yielding variety or other factors that are important to you. One other thing I'd like you to note is that of the 7, notice that 5 of them are the newly released varieties. So I think that's pretty exciting. And if you're familiar with the book, I hope everyone is, we do have a lot of data present in them. And data would include important factors such as straw strength and also tolerance to disease, such as leaf and stripe rust or tan spot, also bacterial leaf streak, and then of course our longtime foe head blight or fusarium head blight. So let's take a look at a number of categories. Straw strength is certainly very important. This is data from statewide, and then we gave ratings, 1 being the strongest and 9 being the weakest. And we certainly would encourage people, if other factors are the same, certainly choose a variety that is designated as having a 4 or less. And we're confident that we have adequate straw strength out there. So you notice that the strongest straw varieties, there's a couple that have a designation of 2. Linkard is a Minnesota release, and certainly a standard on comparing other varieties as far as straw strength. And then Cropland has a new variety, 3903, that's also has very strong straw. And then, as you probably noticed already, there's a lot of new varieties, those with the asterisks, that do have very adequate straw strength. So a nice selection there with the newer ones. And of course, we have a lot of other ones as well that have good straw strength. The scab is certainly very important. We have a partial listing of varieties based on the extremes of our range that goes from 1 to 9, with 1 being resistant. We don't have any of those, but we do have some in the 3 and 4 category that certainly provide good tolerance. A speaker that will be following later this morning, Andrew Fiskop, I'm very positive that he'll be giving you some more detail on scab, and variety section is only one part of this. Certainly we want to have you consider the use of fungicides, timely use, as well as crop rotation. So getting back to varieties, we do have a nice selection of varieties in that 3 to 4 rating, including some of the newer ones that again are identified by the asterisk following their name. And certainly be careful of those that have high susceptibility. There's 3 of them that are listed, 2 that are new varieties. And And it's interesting that Longmire and Dagmar are solid stem varieties. And then Soren, most everyone's familiar with that and probably are aware that we need to be very careful about its susceptibility to scab. Another maybe emerging disease is bacterial leaf streak. Certainly in the East, it's a very important consideration. And we don't have fungicides, of course, for this, so we rely quite heavily on variety tolerance. Fortunately, we do have a lot of varieties that have an adequate amount of tolerance, and those are listed on the left-hand side of this table. And we like to have as low a number designation as possible, and so we do have some selection for tolerance. Those varieties that are bolded, I made a designation a little bit different, but those bolded would be the new varieties, those released in 2019 through 2020. Okay, so if everything else is similar, choosing a variety with a rating of 4 or less is quite important. And I'm suspecting that Andrew will show this slide, but I'm going to show it as well, just to emphasize the importance of ratings. So you notice pretty quickly from this data that was generated in the Grand Forks area in 2019 that when we get past a rating of 4, that we start to see some yield declines if bacterial leaf strike is present in the field and affecting our flag leaves in particular. And so gosh, when we get to a rating of 6 and beyond, we can see some dramatic yield losses if the disease is present, and so please consider that. I screenshot this page from the quality report, just to emphasize that we do have ratings for our most popular varieties. As you've noticed by now, on the right-hand margin, we have some ratings by stars, and certainly at the top of the list is Glen. Linkert is another high-quality variety, as well as Bowles. And Froberg is not listed here, but that would have a very good rating as well. So please consider that as you consider the many other factors when you select varieties. As I mentioned earlier, on the opposite end of the scale, we are concerned about Shelley and Valda, both fairly popular varieties, particular Valda, because they have just an average rating, at least by NDSU. All right, so now we're gonna give you some output on varieties to consider. And I'm maybe being a little silly here, but anyway, the next few slides we'll have some discussion. And Paige, sorry, you're number 4. You probably could move up to at least 3. I think you know more about wheat varieties than our football coach, but he's a pretty important guy on campus, so I thought I'd include him in the list. Okay, well, we'll get a little more serious now with some listing. So keep in mind, this is my view on varieties based on the scrutiny of our data, and these are only guidelines. And I can't imagine that everyone in the audience, the last number I saw, there were about 80 people, that everyone's going to agree with this. I know you won't, but again, I'm showing these as a guideline for you. So the first parameter is that I'm choosing varieties that have above average yield based on the database that's listed, the West locations, 3 years, 4 locations, and involve 21 varieties. So it would not include the newest varieties because we don't have, they're not included in this larger database. So we're looking at above average yield, above average protein from the 2020 statewide data, plus strong straw. So I think everyone agreed it'd be excellent to have these 3 factors as a starting point in our selection. So when I reviewed the numbers and the varieties, there were 2 that made the cut, and they included Lanning, which has these factors. If you see things in parentheses, that means that's a weakness with the variety. So with Lanning, scab, and bacterial leaf streak, the variety is susceptible. And then the other one that made the cut was Rockford. It has lower test weight and also has susceptibility to scab and bacterial leaf streak. Okay, so that's not a very large list at all. So maybe we need to loosen it up a little bit. So here's another parameter, and here I dropped above average protein, and then went with those varieties that have very good yield. In this case, I'm using the database from the 4 West locations, 2020 data. It involved 42 varieties, and it was a high yielding group. And I show the range in there of 46 to 54 bushels as the average. And then I wanted to include strong straw. So with those parameters, there's 4 varieties that made the cut again. Ballistic was one. It also has scab tolerance. The next 2, notice that they have asterisks. They're actually the new varieties. Driver is a South Dakota variety and also has good test weight and scab tolerance, but is susceptible to the bacterial disease. And then Torgy is Minnesota's one of the newest ones. And in addition to the high yield and strong straw, it also has scab and bacteria tolerance. And then the 4th one is Spitfire. It also has bacterial leaf streak tolerance, but is susceptible to scab. Initially, I did add another variety, Shelly, because it made the cut on these parameters, high yield and strong straw, but I decided to take it off because of concern with quality. So you may want to keep that in mind. Well, how about the new varieties that I've been emphasizing during this talk? And so I want to show you the list. So the parameters are like the first parameter I showed in the previous slide, above average yield based on the 4 West location averages this past season, and then protein that's above average on the North Dakota database from this past year, plus strong straw. And there's 3 of them that came through. Commander with bacterial, also has bacterial tolerance. Longmire that also has good test weight, but susceptible to scab and bacterial leaf streak. And then Wildcat that in addition to the parameters also has very good test weight. So that's a suggestion again. This is subjective, but it's a suggestion on if you're still considering varieties, here's some good ones to consider. I'm going to back up one and just make one other statement. As you look at this initial list of varieties that are based on the parameters, in particular the first one, you notice something very obvious that's missing based on or referring to varieties, and that is our popular varieties. I wasn't looking that close initially as I was taking the time to go through these, but the popular varieties are not showing up with these parameters. So consider that. We certainly have opportunities for substitutions with some newer varieties. So now it's your turn to do the homework, and I know you've done some already, but we have a very nice electronic selection tool. And if you Google NDSU wheat variety tool, very likely that'll come up in the search. And so I'd encourage you to use this. It's I just showed you parameters I use for narrowing down the varieties that might be considered. You can do the same with this tool. It's got you can select protein, yield, etc. You can do it very localized if you type in your zip code and then check nearby locations. Or if you want a very large database on the varieties that you're considering, you can check all of North Dakota or even all locations that include Minnesota data as well. So I encourage you to use this as you make your plans for varieties. So what's new? And I thought it'd be kind of exciting to talk about something new. NDSU in their experimental lines do not share that with the public. And recently though, I took in a virtual program where I heard Minnesota's harvest spring wheat breeder give a discussion. And he had details on an experimental line that I thought, well, maybe I'll share that today. Of course, there's a couple of varieties, Minnesota released varieties that seem to be performing well in the West, and maybe this will be a candidate in the future. It appears that it'll be released if it goes through final tests in 2022, so it's a ways off. But I want to talk about something new. And so if you look at the bolded information relating to the line, and let's compare it to Igmar. And so certainly this new line has higher yield potential. It has very good straw strength. Igmar is adequate, but this new line is more like Linkert and having exceptionally strong straw. Test weight is similar to Igmar. Protein a little bit less compared to Igmar, but we'd expect that with higher yield potential. I'm a little concerned about baking quality and the pre-harvest sprouting with a scale of 1 to 9, with 1 being the best. It looks very good and similar to Igmar. And then the rust, limited data, but it looks okay. And with bacterial leaf streak and scab, it has higher ratings or more susceptibility as compared to Igmar. So a sneak peek on something that might be coming from public institutions that we may have available in the future. So that's my prepared comments for today. I hope some will be useful as you continue your plans for the upcoming crop season.
Thank you very much, Greg, for the presentation. We do have a couple questions for you. The first one is, I have Valda in my planting intentions for 2021. The BLS rating is poor. Do drier conditions, such as what we are looking at right now, affect that BLS rating?
Yes, it certainly would decrease the risk of having bacterial leaf streak present in the field. At Carrington at the Research Extension Center, we see bacterial leaf streak every year under our center pivots where we have our irrigated wheat variety trials or other wheat trials. And but it's hit and miss other years. And Andrew Fiskrop again will talk more about biology, I'm sure. But yes, moisture is an important part of having the risk from the disease. Another important part is that the tissue needs to be damaged in the plant from hail or high winds and driving rain. That combination, along with having the disease present, certainly increases the risk. So that's if all other factors that you're considering are the same, certainly if you have the chance to choose a variety that has more tolerance, that would be good.
All right, thank you. Another question also kind of alludes to the possibility that we're looking at a dry year. And the question is, should there be any consideration on maturity, whether short or long, when considering a dry year? Or is maturity date not as important for wheat as, say, corn or soybeans?
I would agree that maturity date isn't as important for wheat as it is for soybean and corn, but it still is important. Obviously, the earlier we can get the wheat in the ground, the spring, the better. And yeah, then it's a guessing game, really. It depends on, if we get timely rains that Phil had talked about this year, most of the state will need to rely on those timely rains to have at least an adequate crop. And so, with short maturing varieties, maybe they'll get through the season quicker and utilize moisture that's available earlier as compared to a long maturing variety that maybe when it gets to the susceptible period of seed development, we just run out of water. And then that type of variety, a long maturing one, would be more susceptible. So how's that for hedging? And none of us can predict the weather. And so you'll just have to do your best on making that decision on shorter versus long maturing varieties.
Thank you, Greg. And